What if I told you that a decorated U.S. Marine once laughed at the faith of an entire nation? Not in a bar, not in a joke between friends, but in a crowded Manila hospital corridor, while Filipino families clutched rosaries, whispered prayers, and begged a God he did not believe in to spare the ones they loved. Have you ever seen a man so trained for war that he mistook tenderness for weakness and prayer for superstition? This is the story of Staff Sergeant Marcus Hale, a soldier who trusted steel more than scripture, strategy more than surrender. He came to Manila certain that bullets and discipline were the only things that saved lives. But one night in this city of storms and whispered prayers, the faith he mocked would become the very thing that held him together. Something people whispered only when they were certain no one could hear them. War had shaped him the way rivers shape stone slowly, relentlessly, without asking permission. His body moved with the instinctive precision of a man trained to expect danger, to control chaos, to trust only what could be touched, measured, or forced into order. In the eyes of his commanders, he was dependable. In the eyes of his fellow Marines, he was unshakable. But when he looked at himself in the mirror each morning, he saw a man carved out of discipline, not meaning. A man who could survive almost anything, but could not remember the last time he felt at peace. That quiet hollowness traveled with him the moment he stepped into Manila after the typhoon. The air was thick with heat and the lingering scent of rain. Streets glistened, not with beauty, but with the residue of flooding mud, broken plastic, fragments of lives swept into corners where no one had the strength to collect them yet. Children balanced on pieces of driftwood, mothers carried buckets of water, and men patched their roofs with whatever scraps the storm had not stolen. Yet through the exhaustion, through the debris, there was something Marcus did not expect to see. Prayer. Not the private, embarrassed kind he had witnessed in barracks before a dangerous deployment. This was different. Open, unashamed, constant. It pulsed in the air like a heartbeat. Inside the temporary hospital, lanterns flickered against the walls. Generators whirred like tired lungs. Nurses moved from one bed to another with the endurance of people who had not slept for days. And at the end of the hallway, where the floor was still damp from the storm, families knelt in a circle, whispering words Marcus could not understand. Words that carried a weight he did not want to understand. Some held small statues of Santo Niño. Others clutched rosaries until their knuckles turned white. Tears fell freely, some from fear, some from hope. It was a scene Marcus had no category for. He stood watching for a long moment. Arms crossed, posture rigid. And then, almost involuntarily, he exhaled a short laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel on purpose. But it was a laugh, born of disbelief. The reflex of a man who had spent too long surviving by refusing to believe in anything he could not control. A young Filipino nurse turned when she heard it. She looked exhausted. Her hair tied back in a loose knot, a clipboard pressed to her chest. But her eyes carried something that disarmed him, not anger, not fragility, but a quiet disappointment, like someone watching a child break something sacred without knowing its worth. "Some things keep people alive, Sergeant," she said softly. "Even when medicine can't." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't know how. Her voice lingered in the space between them, gentle yet firm, as if offered rather than argued. He walked away, but the words followed him through the rest of the night. When he finally lay down on a cot in the dim classroom where the Marines slept, her voice echoed again, threading itself into the storm winds that rattled the window frames. He tried to dismiss it as sentimentality, but something inside him tightened in a way that felt uncomfortably close to truth. Sleep didn't come easily. It hadn't for years. But now, the sleeplessness felt different. He thought about the hallway lit by candles, the families praying, with a desperation that somehow didn't look like despair, the nurse who spoke to him as though she saw through his armor without intention or effort, and beneath all of it, a restless question he tried to bury. Why did their faith bother him so much? Why did it frighten him more than danger ever had? Morning arrived with orders. A bridge on the outskirts of Manila had collapsed during the storm, cutting off a small community surrounded by rising water. Dozens were trapped on the other side, including children and elderly who could not swim. Local responders were overwhelmed, exhausted, and pleading for assistance. The Marines were requested to help. Marcus welcomed the mission. Action meant clarity. Action meant silence in the mind. He checked his gear with the comfort of routine, letting muscle memory carry him through tasks he had performed 1,000 times. But when he climbed onto the transport truck, ready to push aside the unease of the night before, he saw her again, the same nurse, standing near the entrance of the hospital, hands clasped, praying for the departing teams. Her lips moved quietly. Her eyes were closed. It was not a performance, not a ritual. It was devotion, offered freely, without expectation. Marcus turned away quickly, irritation forcing its way into his throat. Yet beneath the irritation lay something he would not name, a tremor, almost invisible, almost tender. He didn't know it then. But the mission he believed would steady him was the very moment the ground beneath his certainty would begin to crack. Marcus didn't usually notice the sky. Years of deployment had taught him to read terrain, not beauty. But as the truck rolled out of central Manila toward the outskirts where the bridge had collapsed, he found his eyes drifting upward. The morning clouds hung low and uneven, streaked with the pale gold of a sun fighting its way through the humidity. The air tasted like the ocean, salted, heavy, and trembling with the memory of last night's storm. Everything was in motion. Water draining through broken gutters, tarps flapping against half-collapsed shacks, people carrying crates of supplies from one corner of the street to another. Yet there was an undercurrent of calm, as if the city, battered and bruised, had decided to breathe again. He watched children waving at the Marine convoy as it passed, their feet bare, their clothes worn, their faces bright with an optimism he didn't understand. One boy shouted something in Tagalog, his grin wide as the truck splashed through a shallow puddle. Marcus wanted to look away, but he didn't. Something in their joy so effortless, so unprotected pressed against him like a question he had no answer for. By the time they reached the damaged bridge, the situation was worse than the briefing had described. The storm surge had eaten away at the concrete supports, leaving a jagged skeleton of rebar and broken stone. The remaining slabs trembled with every gust of wind. On the other side, families were gathered on a small hill, waving frantically for help. Children clung to their mothers. A few men tried shouting instructions, but the distance and the water between them made communication almost impossible. Marcus stepped down from the truck, boots sinking slightly into the mud. The world around him seemed to hold its breath. The waters below were murky, swirling with debris, wood, plastic, the remnants of someone's home. But there was movement too. Filipino volunteers were already wading through the current, guiding makeshift rafts built from bamboo and empty jugs lashed together with rope. They weren't soldiers. They weren't trained, yet they moved with the determination of people who loved fiercely. One of the Filipino Marines approached Marcus. It was Corporal Lunas, the same man who had greeted him the first day. His uniform was wet, his face streaked with dirt, but his expression carried that same unmistakable softness Marcus had seen before. A softness he still mistook for weakness. "Sergeant Hale," Lunas said, catching his breath. "The water is rising again. We need to move fast." Marcus nodded, scanning the scene. "What's your extraction plan?" Lunas pointed to the rafts. "We're doing what we can." It wasn't a plan Marcus would have approved of under normal circumstances, but there was no time for debate. He signaled his team, lifted a coil of rope over his shoulder, and waded into the water. The cold surprised him. He was used to desert heat, not this humid chill that seeped through his uniform like a second skin. Each step was slow, deliberate, the mud pulling at his boots. On the far bank, the families reacted with hope. A woman began to cry. A man lifted his child onto his shoulders so the Marines could see him more clearly. Marcus caught the child's gaze wide, fearful, trusting. Something shifted inside him, gently, almost imperceptibly. They worked for hours, moving group after group across the unstable crossing, guiding them through the water, lifting them onto the rafts, calming the terrified, steadying the elderly, whose legs trembled beneath the weight of exhaustion. Marcus expected chaos. Instead, he found coordination. Filipino volunteers formed human chains. Teenagers guided ropes through the current. Mothers whispered prayers into their children's ears. And every time a raft reached the safe bank, someone prayed again. A whisper. A sign of the cross. A quiet, "Salamat po, Lord." It unsettled him. It fascinated him. It softened something he didn't know, remained soft. At one point, when an elderly man nearly slipped into the water, Marcus caught him and pulled him back. The man clung to him, shaking, whispering in rough English, "God sent you, sir. God sent you." Marcus stiffened. "No, sir. I'm just doing my job." The old man smiled weakly. "Your job, maybe. But his grace." Marcus had no answer for that. He simply nodded and turned away, but the words followed him like ripples across a dark surface. By the time the last group was rescued, the sun was sinking behind the clouds again, painting the sky with muted shades of orange and violet. The exhaustion hit him all at once. His arms ached. His legs felt heavy. His uniform was soaked. But for the first time in a very long while, the fatigue felt meaningful, purposeful, almost sacred. As he stood catching his breath, he noticed something on the far edge of the hill. A small girl, no older than 7, knelt beside a cracked statue of the Santo Niño half buried in the mud. Her dress was torn, her shoes were missing. Yet she prayed with her hands folded, her eyes closed, her lips moving in quiet devotion. Marcus felt an unexpected ache in his chest. Not pain, not pity. Something gentler, something he had forgotten existed. "Do you know what she's saying?" he asked Lunas quietly. Lunas glanced at the girl. "She's thanking God that we came." Marcus swallowed. His throat felt tight. "She doesn't even know us." "She doesn't have to," Lunas said softly. "Faith isn't about knowing, it's about trusting." Marcus looked at him for a long moment, unsure how to respond. Then he looked back at the girl, and for the first time, he didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss it. He simply watched, feeling something unfamiliar settle beneath his ribs, like a tenderness he wasn't ready for, but couldn't push away. As they prepared to leave, the nurse from the hospital arrived with a new team of medics. She carried a backpack of supplies, her uniform wrinkled, her hair pulled back in the same loose knot. She approached Marcus with a steady calm. "You did good work today, Sergeant." He nodded, unsure why her words mattered. "We just did what had to be done." She smiled faintly. "That's how grace begins." He looked away, startled by the warmth rising inside him. She didn't know it. He didn't know it. But in that moment, so small, so quiet, his heart had already begun to change. The rain returned without warning. Manila had a way of doing that, turning the sky into a trembling drum, unleashing water as if testing how much the human heart could bear. Marcus was back near the temporary hospital, helping coordinate the transfer of supplies from a stranded ambulance when the downpour intensified. The wind howled against the thin metal sheets overhead. Nurses rushed to secure equipment. Volunteers covered patients with plastic sheets, and the narrow courtyard filled with the unmistakable urgency of a city bracing for another blow. Marcus moved quickly, instinctively, as he always had. But storms, like truths, often arrived in the one moment a man let his guard down. A loose section of roofing snapped free from the wind, slicing downward like a blade of rusted steel. In the split second before it hit, Marcus pushed a volunteer aside, feeling the full force strike his shoulder and send him to the ground. The impact flashed a sharp, electric pain through his body. His vision blurred, voices swirled. Water rushed against his face. He tried to stand, but the world tilted, slipping into a muted haze of sound and shadow. He didn't remember blacking out. Only the sensation of hands lifting him, steady but trembling, as if carrying both his weight and the unspoken fear that surrounded him. When his eyes opened again, the ceiling was unfamiliar. The lights were dim. The storm outside had become a distant roar. He lay on a cot inside the hospital classroom, the same place where the Marines slept. Yet it felt different now, as if the room itself were breathing slower, quieter. The first thing he saw was her, the Filipino nurse he had mocked on his first night, the one who had told him that some things kept people alive when medicine couldn't. She was pressing a clean bandage to his shoulder, her face calm, but her hands moving with urgency. When she saw him awake, relief softened her features, though she tried to hide it beneath professional composure. "You're lucky," she whispered, a few inches lower, and she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Marcus blinked, disoriented. "What happened?" "You saved a volunteer," she said. "And God saved you." He almost scoffed, the old reflex rising from habit. But the pain in his shoulder, the trembling in his limbs, the vulnerability he could not disguise, everything conspired to silence his pride. He simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain crash outside like a battlefield he no longer recognized. The nurse dipped a cloth into warm water, wiping the blood and dirt from his skin. Her movements were gentle, practiced, reverent. Marcus felt exposed in a way he hadn't since childhood, not physically, but spiritually, as if someone had peeled back the layers he had spent decades constructing. He wanted to speak, to explain himself, but no words came. "You laugh at our prayers," she said quietly, not accusing, not triumphant. "But when the storm hit, every person you helped today prayed for you. They prayed you'd come back safely. They prayed for your strength. Even the little girl you saw on the hill." Marcus remembered her, the tiny figure kneeling beside the cracked Santo Niño statue. Her small voice carried through the memory like a fragile hymn. Something inside him tightened, slowly, painfully, as if pulling free from years of silence. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why would they pray for someone they don't know?" The nurse looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and unwavering faith. "Because that's what we do," she said. "We pray for those who show up, for those who help, for those who try. Faith isn't earned here, Sergeant. It's offered." He closed his eyes. For a moment, the world receded, and there was only the sound of his own breathing and the steady rhythm of the rain. Hours passed. The pain dulled, but something deeper, a quiet, aching realization began to form. He remembered the old man calling him Grace. He remembered the nurse's steady disappointment on his first day. He remembered the girl, thanking God for the Marines she had never met. These memories gathered inside him like scattered embers drawn toward a single flame. When he opened his eyes again, the storm had settled into a gentle drizzle. The room glowed with the warm softness of lantern light. The nurse was still there, now seated beside him, her hands clasped in prayer. Marcus watched her silently. She did not notice he was awake. He listened not to her words, which were whispered too softly to decipher, but to the intention behind them. There was a kind of sacredness in her posture, in the quiet lift of her shoulders, in the stillness she created simply by surrendering a moment to something beyond herself. For the first time in years, Marcus didn't feel threatened by faith. He felt drawn to it. "What are you praying for?" he asked. She opened her eyes slowly. "For strength. For you. For everyone out there tonight." She hesitated, then added softly, "And for humility. Sometimes, storms teach us what silence cannot." Marcus felt those words settle inside him like seeds dropped into soil cracked by drought. A sudden knock interrupted them. Corporal Lunas entered the room, soaked from the rain, worry etched deeply into his face. When he saw Marcus awake, he let out a breath he'd been holding far too long. "Sir, the bridge area is flooding again," Lunas said. "We need to move the last of the supplies now, but the path is dangerous." Marcus sat up despite the nurse's protest. "I can walk." "You should rest," she said firmly. "I've rested enough." But when he stood, his knees nearly buckled. Lunas caught him with a steady grip. Together, they moved outside into the night. The rain had softened, but the air was thick with the trembling aftermath of the storm. Water pooled along the walkways, reflecting the pale glow of lanterns strung between poles. Every sound, the rustle of tarps, the quiet cries of children, the distant alarms felt woven with a fragile sense of hope. As they reached the flooded courtyard, another wave of exhaustion washed over Marcus. His vision blurred again. His breath became unsteady. The nurse who had followed them stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "Sit," she said gently. "Just for a moment." He did, not out of weakness, but because something inside him finally surrendered not to pain, not to fear, but to the realization that he didn't have to carry everything alone. And then, without warning, a memory surfaced: his mother, kneeling by his childhood bed, whispering a prayer before he left for boot camp. He hadn't thought about it in years. He had dismissed it as a ritual he could live without. But now, in the middle of Manila's broken night, her voice rose inside him like a forgotten hymn. The nurse knelt beside him. "Sergeant," she said softly, "there is a verse my father used to say every time a storm came. For he will command his angels concerning you, to guard you in all your ways." Psalm 91:11. The words slipped into him like light finding its way through a cracked door. Angels guard you, all your ways. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat tightened with an emotion he didn't recognize. Something gentler than grief, heavier than gratitude, older than fear. He stared at the nurse, then at Lunas, then at the sky above them, where the clouds were beginning to break, allowing a few timid stars to appear. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus felt watched over, not by rank, not by training, not by the armor he built around his heart, but by something he could not see, yet could no longer deny. The storm had not broken him, it had humbled him, and in that humility, he felt something sacred return: a stillness, a clarity, a peace he had chased unknowingly through war after war. It arrived not in victory, but in surrender, quiet, small, luminous. The storm had passed. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but in the slow, hesitant way Manila storms often surrendered, like a great sigh slipping through the horizon. By dawn, the air held the scent of wet earth and seawater, and the sky blushed with pale shades of rose and gold. Marcus stepped outside the classroom hospital slowly, his shoulder bound, his steps cautious but steady. The city felt different, or perhaps he did. People were already awake, mothers sweeping puddles from their doorsteps, men hauling broken timber to clear the road, children chasing one another through the mud with a joy that defied circumstance. Nurses walked between tents with quiet purpose, offering water, medicine, and sometimes simply presence. And in the stillness before the sun truly rose, someone began to pray, not loudly, not ceremonially, but gently, as if weaving gratitude into the morning air. Marcus paused. Months ago, he might have rolled his eyes or walked away, but today, he simply listened. Something inside him, something long neglected, leaned toward the sound, as if his heart recognized a language his mind did not. He made his way toward the hill where the rescued families were gathered. The mud had dried into cracked patterns beneath his boots. The broken statue of the Santo Niño still lay half-buried near the roots of a tree, but now someone had placed a fresh white flower beside it, a symbol not of what had been lost, but of what remained. The little girl he had seen praying earlier stood beside the statue again. Her dress was cleaner now, though still worn. Her hair was tied in a loose ponytail. When she saw him, her eyes brightened with a recognition that felt almost like welcome. "You came back," she said softly. Marcus nodded. "I wanted to see how you were doing." She smiled, small but radiant. Then, without hesitation, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something tied in thin red thread. A simple wooden cross, the kind carved from leftover scraps by local artisans. She held it out to him with hands still dirt-stained from playing in the mud. "For you," she whispered. Marcus stared at the cross, unable to speak. It was not expensive. It was not polished. But there was a weight to it. A sincerity. A purity that made his throat tighten. I can't take this," he said. "You helped us," she replied, as if that explained everything. "Papa says when someone helps you, you give them something from the heart." Her words, innocent and unguarded, pressed against a place in him that had remained sealed for years. Slowly, he reached out his hand and accepted the cross. It felt warm from her touch, light yet powerful, like a promise. "Thank you," he murmured. "I'll keep it safe." As the sun rose higher, Marcus found himself walking toward the riverbank, where Lunas and the volunteers were clearing debris. The water glimmered with early light, carrying small fragments of bamboo and leaves downstream. Lunas looked up and smiled with that same unshakable softness. "You look different today, Sergeant," he said. Marcus wasn't sure how to respond. He simply exhaled. "Maybe I am." Lunas nodded knowingly. "Storms do that. They scrape away things we don't need." They worked together in silence, a peaceful silence that felt nothing like the silence Marcus had feared for so long. This silence had breath, warmth, reverence. When they finished, Marcus walked toward the shade of a mango tree, letting the breeze dry the sweat on his forehead. The nurse found him there. She carried a small cup of ginger tea, steam rising gently from the rim. "You should drink this," she said. "It helps with pain." He accepted the cup, wrapping his fingers around the warmth. "Thank you. For everything." She sat beside him, leaving a respectful space between them. "You don't have to thank me." "I do," Marcus said quietly. "You took care of me. Even after I—" He hesitated, trying to find the right words. "I've been wrong about a lot of things." The nurse's gaze softened. "Faith doesn't need you to understand it all at once. It just needs you to stop running from it." Marcus looked down at the wooden cross in his hand. "I don't know if I believe," he said, voice low. "Not like you. Not like them." "You don't need to," she replied. "Belief isn't a switch, it's a door. You open it a little, and light finds its way in." He sat quietly, letting the words settle. The breeze rustled the leaves above them, casting shifting patterns of gold across the ground. "What made you believe?" he finally asked. She looked toward the horizon, thinking. "Pain," she said honestly. "Losing someone. And then finding peace I couldn't explain. A peace that didn't come from strength, or logic, or control. Just grace." Marcus felt that word in his chest, like a slow-burning ember. Grace. He had spent his whole life trying to earn worth through discipline, through control, through being unbreakable. But this grace she spoke of was gentler. It met him where he was wounded, prideful, uncertain, and did not turn him away. He closed his eyes. The cross rested in his palm, warm from the sun. The morning air wrapped around him like a quiet blessing. A verse rose in his mind not from memory, but from the night before, spoken by the nurse with such reverence that it had embedded itself in his thoughts. "For he will command his angels concerning you, to guard you in all your ways." Psalm 91:11. He whispered it now, barely audible, testing the shape of the words on his tongue. It felt unfamiliar, it felt fragile, but it also felt true. The nurse heard him and smiled. Not a triumphant smile, a grateful one. "Another verse," she said gently, "helped me once." She paused, letting the moment breathe. "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Psalm 34:18. Marcus opened his eyes. The words settled over him like a warm cloth placed on a fevered brow. Near to the brokenhearted. Saves the crushed in spirit. He had never admitted brokenness before, never allowed himself to be crushed. Yet he felt both now and for the first time, he was not ashamed. He remained there for a long time, listening to the distant laughter of children, the rustle of tarps, the murmur of prayers carried on the morning breeze. Manila, with all its noise and chaos and light, no longer felt foreign. It felt honest. It felt ancient. It felt like a place where the armor he wore out of habit could finally loosen. He breathed deeply, letting the peace fill him from the inside out, the peace of being held rather than holding everything together. When he finally rose to his feet, the wooden cross still in his hand, he felt lighter. Not because the world had grown easier, but because something inside him had shifted, softened, opened. He didn't know what the next chapter of his life would look like. He didn't know how long this newfound stillness would last. But he knew this. He would no longer run from faith, or from silence, or from the tenderness he once mistook for weakness. As he stepped into the soft glow of morning, a quiet gratitude bloomed in his chest, gentle as a prayer. Silence, light, gratitude.